1973 was a rather ordinary year for Cadillac in that it was partway through the 1971 to 76 full-size Cadillac generation that would really be the largest Cadillacs ever produced. The 71 to 76 generation were true full-sizers, and in 1977, Cadillac would downsize their lineup quite significantly, and actually, that was a move that worked out quite well overall for the division and its customers, as some of the cars had just grown so large that they couldn't even fit in people's garages anymore.
Imagine driving a car that rode atop a 130-inch or 133-inch wheelbase, depending upon whether you drove a Cadillac DeVille,
Calais, or Fleetwood, and then trying to park something that was 230-ish inches long in your garage. It was a rather challenging feat. And for 1973, the cars were admittedly a bit longer from the 1971 and 72 versions because they had to meet the 5-mile-an-hour impact standard in the front and a 2.5-mile-per-hour impact standard in the rear. And that's why the Cadillacs for 1973 received this funny kind of rubber flubber coating to the rear quarter panels to help prevent dings and damage associated with those dings. And in later years, they would get those awful huge fender extensions that by now would be cracking and you'd have to replace them, or the car would just look simply awful. But I wanted to share with you a special 1973 Cadillac because it's so rare. I actually have never seen a 1973 or even a 71 to 76 Cadillac so equipped. And that is this 1973 Cadillac Calais, which has no air conditioning. Now, let me just pause for a second here and talk a little bit about this car. The Calais was the cheap Cadillac, if you will, during this time frame. It was kind of your entry price point Cadillac. Never was really a good seller because, well, if you were going to buy a Cadillac, you tended to buy a DeVille or something that was more expensive. But nonetheless, they did have this Calais at the low end of the lineup. And as a result, given that it was at the low end of the lineup, they cheaped out on a number of things on the Calais. The first is that if you see the pedal trim here, you'll notice that it doesn't have the stainless trim on it. It's just the black plastic. That was one of the cost cuts that a customer received when they bought the Calais. The second is in the door panels on the DeVille and the Fleetwood series, there would be lights, kind of like puddle lights that would illuminate the ground when you open the door to help you see if there was a puddle on the ground or something at nighttime. You did not get those in the Calais. You just got reflectors in that space. The third thing was on the dash, you didn't get the faux wood grain. Yes, Cadillac was even cheap enough to pass on giving you faux wood grain. They just gave you this awful looking black plastic instrument panel that looked like it belonged in a Chevrolet at best. Cadillac was kind of phoning it in when it came to interior materials during this time frame because they were selling all the cars that they could build. They were having great sales years during this time frame, and I guess they just lost interest in putting expensive materials in interiors. But one of the things many people don't know is that air conditioning was optional even in Cadillacs during this time frame. You had to pay extra for it. And if you got air conditioning in your Cadillac, you were forced into buying automatic climate control. There was not a manual air conditioning function or availability on Cadillacs. It was either no air or automatic climate control. And as a consequence, almost every single Cadillac that I've ever seen in the flesh has automatic climate control from this time period. And you can always tell those because on the driver's side of the instrument panel, there's the climate control panel. You have the little thumb wheel where you set the temperature, and then the temperature automatically adjusts, as well as the fan speed, as well as where the air comes out based on the setting, as well as the current interior temperature and the outside ambient temperature. And I have to say the system generally works quite well when it's in operation, which these systems are relatively reliable. They work quite flawlessly. Actually, I would say they work better than modern automotive climate controls. It always seems to be moving the temperature around a lot and moving the fan speed up and down and where the air outlet comes out. These are pretty consistent performers from an automatic climate control standpoint. However, as I mentioned, it was optional, and I have never in the flesh seen a Cadillac that didn't have air conditioning and the automatic climate control. So when this popped up on Facebook Marketplace in Canada, I have to say I was shocked to see that the car didn't have air conditioning. And it kind of makes sense because, well, it's in Canada, and at least back then, it didn't necessarily get all that hot in the summertime in Canada. So somebody bought a Calais and then cheaped out and didn't even get air conditioning in their Calais. But I have to say, it's the most bizarre looking interior I've ever seen in a Cadillac. First of all, because you have a Calais and you have this cheaped out instrument panel with horrible black plastic that just looks abysmal. But on top of that, because this car doesn't have air conditioning, take a look, and there are just these caps where the air conditioning vents would normally be on the driver's side, and on the far side for the passenger, it's just capped off. And it clearly looks like Cadillac wasn't even trying. They're trying to embarrass you because you elected not to get air conditioning. It just looks so humorous and so bad. They didn't even have a different instrument panel, probably because they estimated the take rate on cars without air conditioning to be so low that they came up with this, well, half-assed solution, shall we say. Then there are these middle vents that I'm guessing there's a pull underneath the steering column where you can activate the vent for those middle vents. You can see in this photo that there is a vent pull in the kick well that you can open and get some fresh air that way. But overall, it just looks absolutely horrible. And then you look at the climate control head, and it's pretty comical as well. There's settings for heat and defrost there at the top right. You can move the slider bar to the right, and it has hotter outlet temperature. And then there's a fan speed control at the top left, and that's it. So you get the heat, the defrost, and the temperature and fan speed. And it looks like it's this crappy, cheap panel. It's not even Cadillac quality looking, I would say. Again, looks like it belongs in a bargain basement car. And then let's turn under hood for a second, and you can look at the 472 cubic inch V8 under hood that you got standard in the Cadillac DeVille. You can only get the 500 in the Eldorado still in this year. This engine made 220 horsepower, 365 pound-feet of torque. But here's what's humorous to me is normally on these Cadillac V8s, they have the air conditioning compressor in the center of the V, in the front of the engine as part of the accessory drive. And clearly there's no air conditioning compressor here. There's no evaporator, no nothing associated with the air conditioning setup that you'd normally find on Cadillacs. However, there's a gaping hole in that space, which is very bizarre. And I love that the radiator hose is the exact same radiator hose as what you would see on an air conditioning equipped car. And as a consequence, notice the hose has this bend in it, and that is so that it can go over the air conditioning compressor and into the thermostat housing. Well, of course, this isn't something that's needed on a non-air conditioning equipped car, but I'm sure Cadillac found that it was just too expensive to have a separate radiator hose, and it made no sense to stock a separate radiator hose. It would just be additional complexity. But nonetheless, it looks humorous to have this radiator hose kind of looping around and curling around to get to the thermostat housing when there is no air conditioning compressor in it. So again, this is the first time I've ever seen one of the Cadillacs of this vintage, of any Cadillac, that didn't have air conditioning. I wonder, have you seen one without air conditioning? Most cars in the 70s, by this time, if they were luxury cars, were starting to get air conditioning, but it still was optional, and in some cases, particularly in Canada and outside the U.S., air conditioning was an extremely expensive option everywhere. Some countries even had a luxury tax on it. And so it just wasn't ordered nearly as frequently outside the U.S., and it wasn't ordered very frequently on non-luxury cars in a number of instances. But this is, again, the first time I've seen a luxury Cadillac. Maybe I shouldn't call a Calais a luxury Cadillac, but I guess I will for purposes of this, without air conditioning. Now, in other ways, the Calais is kind of cool. It has, well, some interesting seat fabric. And in this case, it has no vinyl roof, which I think is actually a net benefit. There was a time where I almost bought a Cadillac Calais. I think it was a 72, and it had no vinyl roof, and it was all black, and it just looked slick. I don't mind the vinyl roof as much on these cars, but I think they do look even better when they are devoid of the vinyl roof, and that is just a super, super rare thing. Most everybody went for the vinyl roof when it came to these cars. So here you have a bargain basement Cadillac, the Calais model, and you have one that doesn't have even air conditioning, And I thought I would just share that with you because I have never seen one before, and it looks horrible on the inside. I just don't know what Cadillac was thinking. What do you think? Put a comment in the comments section. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, take care.